Dando início à sessão 1, Fintech, Visão Geral e Tendências. Convidamos o senhor José Alexandre Vasco, Superintendente de Proteção e Orientação aos Investidores, para a moderação do painel. E para compor a mesa, convidamos os senhores Ricardo Agnesini, líder de Serviços Financeiros da América Latina e Brasil, KPMG, e o senhor Juan Pablo Pardo-Guerra, PhD, do Department of Sociology, University of California, San Diego.
Bom dia a todos. Inicialmente, eu gostaria de fazer um agradecimento aos palestrantes que estão comigo aqui nessa mesa e, brevemente, mencionar a importância dos dois na organização desse evento. Primeiramente, ao Dr. Ricardo Agnesini, por todo o apoio da KPMG durante a reflexão, as reflexões que foram necessárias para o desenho desse seminário, desse primeiro seminário, Fintech Day. Acho que tivemos diversas oportunidades de interagir, de aprendizado e de reflexões a fim de que esse programa, de fato, pudesse ser de interesse não apenas da CVM, dos reguladores, mas também, como o presidente da CVM falou, um diálogo com o mercado e com a sociedade. Ele tem uma larga experiência, eu não vou ler o currículo dele aqui, enfim, porque vai tomar boa parte da apresentação, mas nós estamos muito felizes, satisfeitos e honrados com a sua presença. E ele vai fazer aqui uma apresentação com uma visão geral de fintech e alguns dos desafios que estão colocados, inclusive para os reguladores, no que diz respeito a esse mercado. O meu segundo agradecimento vai ao professor Dr. Juan Pablo Pardo-Guerra, nós tivemos a felicidade de contatá-lo por meio da Faculdade de Antropologia da Universidade Federal do Rio de Janeiro. A CVM possui um núcleo de estudos comportamentais e, especificamente, com a Federal do Rio de Janeiro, nós temos uma interação muito rica no que diz respeito à utilização da antropologia para a compreensão dos comportamentos dos investidores, dos futuros investidores, especialmente a nova classe média. Então, nessas discussões, nós tivemos a oportunidade de encontrar o professor Juan Pablo, convidá-lo para o evento e, especificamente, entendo que a sua contribuição aqui vai ser muito importante, porque ele participou, primeiro, de um trabalho junto com outros especialistas, contratado pelo governo do Reino Unido, para pensar como as novas tecnologias impactariam o futuro do Reino Unido nos próximos anos. Então, foi um estudo sociológico, antropológico, enfim, bastante multidisciplinar, e acho que a sua presença aqui, trazendo hoje uma visão sociológica da regulação desse mercado, vai nos ajudar a refletir também de uma forma diferente, portanto, sobre esses desafios que se colocam para a CVM. Dito isso, eu gostaria de passar a palavra ao professor Juan Pablo. Obrigado.
Muito obrigado. Muito obrigado. I'm going to speak in English because it's a little bit easier when I'm presenting, but so I apologize beforehand. Muitas desculpas. So I want to start by thanking the organizers for the very kind invitation, and I am clearly not your conventional panelist. I am a sociologist of finance working at the University of California in San Diego, but for the past 10, 11 years I've been researching the histories of automation in financial markets, and in particular I've been looking at how specific organizations such as the London Stock Exchange went from being markets based on a trading floor to essentially servers based a couple of blocks away from St. Paul's in London. And today we're all talking about fintech, and it's a very exciting field. It's something that captures a lot of these innovations over the last 30 to 40 years, or that's how it's been presented. And it's also presented as something that is a fundamentally disruptive force to modern finance and banking. As a sociologist, though, I want to bring back some historical perspective. So while I'm talking about trends, I'm not necessarily talking about future trends, but trends that have occurred over the last 70 years. to remind us all that fintech is actually quite old and that its challenges and possibilities are things that we've already seen in the past and that we can learn from. So in order to deal and grapple with fintech in the future, we can look at the past. So what am I referring to, or what am I saying? Basically, if we look at some of the... there it is. Whether we think about pigeons, or the pigeons that Paul Reuters used in the beginning of the 19th century to beat the rail services in continental Europe and accelerate information transmission back in the days, or the ticker tapes that revolutionized the way information was distributed in the late 19th, early 20th century, we can see that technology and finance have been part of the same project for quite a bit of time. Actually, we can go further back, not even to the 19th century, but as far back as the 15th century, and see very basic innovations that were as disruptive as blockchain is today. So if we go back to the 15th century in Italy, we will see the invention of this thing, the double entry bookkeeping account system that essentially allowed people to see profit for the first time in history and constituted capitalism as we know it today, or allowed capitalism to emerge as we know it today. So technologies of different sorts have been there at the core of financial and banking services for quite a while. So we know this quite well, and the question is, how can we grapple with these things in new and innovative manners that will allow us to guarantee the stability of markets? And that's really the questions that I want to address today with a couple of examples. It would seem then, given that technology has been present in finance for a while, that the challenges of fintech are technical. That what we have to talk about when we're thinking about fintech is the technologies and how these technologies have to be sort of thought of, developed, and innovated upon. How do we get flat platforms to communicate to each other? How do we create broad yet resilient standards that serve the entire industry? How do we guarantee user interoperability? How do we build a system that allows monetizing an application? These are the types of questions that we hear a lot in fintech. The point that I want to raise today is that confronting fintech, in thinking about its challenges and possibilities, we should think also about the implications of technological innovations in a wider context, in a wider institutional context. And in particular, we should think of them with respect to the capacity of states and governments to guarantee the stability of markets. At the end of the day, if fintech is disruptive as other technologies were in the past, one of the critical things we have to consider is whether states and governments are capable of dealing with these disruptions in order to guarantee that markets will function and operate in the future. The reason for this is that while technology is certainly important and an important element in the story of fintech, the challenges of fintech are never purely technical. They're more than technical at the end of the day. And this is really a tradition or a point of view that is made, it's sort of stressed in the sociology of technology. Much of this is inspired by a large body of research in how sociologists, anthropologists, and other social scientists understand technological innovation that stresses the fact that technology isn't about machines, it isn't about standards, knowledge, devices, and things. More fundamentally, and as this guy David Noble wrote some years ago, it is always about people themselves and how they deal with surprises, uncertainties, and innovations. And this is how I want us to think about fintech in this brief talk. So really, this idea that technology is about humans, about people, is relevant to fintech too. So what I want to do today is to focus less on the tech in fintech and more on the on finance, on this human aspect that is at the core of these systems and at the core of the operation of modern societies. The key problems of fintech then are human, and indeed, as I want to argue, they derive from the complex interaction of how people adopt systems and technologies that may in the long run disrupt operations and the way systems work, and how also states and existing governmental and regulatory institutions deal with these challenges and these transformations, these very human problems in a sense. And indeed, what I want to do is talk about this classical human issue, this classical human field of regulation and its capacity to deal with fintech. My concern really stems from the fact that organizations and technologies don't always evolve at the same pace. And this is something we hear a lot in the history of finance and also with current developments in fintech and other industries. And this is particularly clear in how regulators deal and grapple with change in the marketplace. Regulators in theory, or at least in theory, are supposed to steer markets in order to guarantee stability and the efficiency of the system. The question is whether they can do this in the face of a rapidly changing financial and technological marketplace, a rapidly changing system. So thinking about regulation makes sense, particularly if we assume that there is this common interest amongst both the developers of technology, the users of the financial services industry, and the members of the marketplace in maintaining a fair, efficient, and stable system. So if we assume this as our point of departure, as our starting point in a sense, we have to wonder to what extent are regulators capable of actually producing this financial system that is stable, fair, and efficient. Of course, recent events in the last 5-6 years would seem to signal that there's a considerable lag between what regulators do and how they see markets and what markets actually produce in relation to technological innovations. Indeed, there's plenty of evidence to suggest that regulators are not completely up to date with technologies to some extent. And this matters considerably for how fintech is absorbed and how it will develop and how it will affect the stability of markets in the future. Think, for instance, of the 2010 flash crash, where stock markets fell by 20% in a span of 15 minutes because of erroneous communications between the trading feeds of the national market system, or the more recent debacle with Knight Securities, one of the prime electronic market makers at the time, that was responsible for about 20% of the trading volumes in US securities, and which, because of an erroneous rollout of a new algorithm, a new trading algorithm, lost $440 million in 20 minutes of operations, and then had to be rescued by a consortium of banks because it was a systemic provider of liquidity within the market. So these two examples show that there is something amiss with how regulators cope with technology, with the capacity of regulators to institute rules and regulations that are sensitive to what technologies do to the financial marketplace. And this is important again because most of the market today is essentially computers and technology and devices. The flash crash, Knight Securities, and similar stories matter to our understanding of fintech because if there is a master story to how financial markets evolved in the 20th century, it is certainly one of how they moved from being face-to-face domains of interactions on trading floors to being essentially distributed high-speed electronic queues in servers. Essentially, that's the big transformation. Technology is central to the market and much of its current challenges. And if this is a story of fintech, it's because it's a story of technology and how it transformed financial practices. And even though it's not as attractive as other stories, such as the story of blockchain, which is very prominent in discussions about fintech, it is critical to the future and the future stability of the marketplace. So the question then is whether regulators know how to deal with this, whether a financial regulator, as we know it today, and as they have been built since the 1930s, more or less, knows how to deal with a system that is populated by these types of things rather than people on trading floors. Can, in other words, stability exist in our current regulatory environment despite rapid technological innovation? And what I want to do is I want to present a couple of bits of evidence that show some of the problems and limitations and institutional bottlenecks that are at the core of our problems with how we deal with technology. And I want to do it with respect to the Securities and Exchange Commission because it's relatively paradigmatic in terms of how it approaches markets and the effects that it's had in shaping finance, at least in the United States. And this really starts with a vignette. And some of you may have heard about this vignette. In January 2015, the Securities and Exchange Commission reached a settlement with UBS Securities because UBS Securities was accused at the time of violating Rule 612 of Regulation National Market System by accepting and ranking hundreds of millions of orders priced in increments smaller than 1 cent. So basically, UBS had built a trading platform that allowed some of its users to send orders to trade in amounts that were priced in less than a penny, which is a violation of the current regulations in the United States. Now, the amazing thing isn't that this happened. This happens all the time, and there's always services that are provided in ways that violate to some extent the current normativities. The amazing thing with this story was that the SEC had known about this for at least 6 years. So the SEC had details about the operation of UBS's alternative trading system, of UBS Securities' alternative trading system, and they didn't act in 6 years. And a legal scholar, noted legal scholar, James Angel, said that for the SEC to take this amount of time to deal with this situation was simply scandalous. It hurts the SEC's credibility as an agency enforcing its own rules. And this is really something that demonstrates that despite having knowledge of the fact that technology is present and that technology is arranged in certain ways within the marketplace, the SEC seems to be slightly incapable of dealing with these particular devices and innovations. So the questions that I ask are, what does the Securities and Exchange Commission see when it regulates markets? Does it see technology? Does it understand how technology fundamentally disrupts the operation of the marketplace? And if it sees it, or depending on how it sees it, what does this imply for the regulation of finance in the future? And what I'm presenting today is something that is a very recent study based on a computational analysis of 2,572 speeches of the Securities and Exchange Commission. So it's a bit of a contradiction. So I'm criticizing the SEC's vision of technology by using big data devices in order to analyze how the SEC operates. But what I want to do with this is show that actually there's a particular framework that the SEC uses in order to understand markets that limits its capacity as a regulator in the face of rapid innovation. So what I did is I took all the speeches of SEC commissioners throughout the 20th century up to 2011. The SEC has 5 commissioners. These are appointed by Congress and sort of nominated by the President of the United States, and they give speeches like any other regulators. And these speeches can vary from 5-minute long speeches to an hour and a half long speeches during dinner or something like that. And what I did is I took the whole corpus of speeches over 70-something years, and I took only the ones that were actually relevant. So speeches that were relatively long, at least 20 minutes long. You don't want the speech of Shapiro introducing someone at a dinner. You want a speech of content. So I took all of those and I applied machine learning methods in order to identify key topics within these speeches. These methods are called topic models, and they're widely used in computational analysis in order to sort and classify texts. So a lot of what we do online, for instance, is based on topic models. The way Google and other service providers categorize the information that we interact with is by looking at texts, identifying themes, and classifying those themes automatically into particular categories. And I did exactly the same thing with the SEC's speeches. And my question was, where is technology in these speeches? Do they see technology? Do they talk about technology? Paradoxically, they do. They do talk about technology, and they have been talking about technology quite a bit. So if we look at mentions and references of the word technology, technologies, or technological, we see that from the 1960s onwards, the frequency of mentions of technology has increased quite a bit. So today, more or less, we get the reference to technology or a mention of technology in about 50% of the speeches by SEC commissioners. So they do see technology. They recognize that technology is there, and these patterns follow historical trends, such as the establishment of the national market system and Reg NMS and all these technology-driven transformations. What is interesting is that when you move into the actual speeches and you look at these topics or themes within the speeches themselves, you see that technology is not necessarily the key driver of the regulator's efforts. And this is a slightly busy and sort of difficult to read graph, but it's a graph that represents the 15 different topics that dominate the conversations at the SEC. These are categorized along a variety of themes. They go from corporate governance, investment intermediaries, accounts and disclosure, global markets, et cetera, to the blue one in the bottom, which is on public mandates. And the only topic or the only theme where technology is really relevant and appears as a term that matters is the one on market structure. This market structure theme is this green one over here. So you can sort of see it emerging in the 1960s and then continuing with some certain frequency. About 5% of the SEC speeches deal directly with market structure, in a sense. So technology was there, but it wasn't a main concern. The SEC had other concerns over its history, such as the discussion about public offers after the Second World War, or the discussion about public companies in the foundation of the organization, which was one of the motives for creating the SEC. So despite recognizing technology, technology doesn't really matter that much. What matters is disclosure, rulemaking, and legislation, in a sense. That is what the SEC actually observes. The way of organizing this in a more readable fashion is by sort of recategorizing some of these 15 themes into 5 large clusters, in a sense. And these clusters refer to investment intermediaries, market structure, rules and enforcement, corporate finance, and regulation and oversight. And again, we see that even though technology is central to how American markets were constituted in the 20th century, it plays a very small role within the logic of the SEC speeches. What matters is oversight. What matters is rulemaking and enforcement. So how is it that the SEC sees technologies? It doesn't see technologies as necessarily radical disruptors. It sees some technologies as objects that have to be protected or sort of driven through rules and disclosure. And this is something that is well known about the SEC as a regulator. It's a regulator that has been captured by a logic of enforcement and disclosure ever since its foundation in the 1930s. And this has driven it to understand technologies through a legal perspective rather than a more technical perspective. And actually, if you look at the composition of the SEC's commissions or commissioners, you see that it's something that is very prominent. So why is it that the SEC understands technology through this logic of disclosure enforcement? Because essentially it's dominated professionally by lawyers. If you look at the way the SEC has hired in the last 70 years, it's been a site for lawyers to work in. It's been less of a site for technologists and people with expertise on financial technologies to develop careers. When you see people from technology working at the SEC, they tend to work in the development of EDGAR, which is the corporate sort of reports or filings data set, rather than the development of technologies to understand, for instance, the infrastructures of American securities markets. And again, this is a story that is inscribed or is associated to this very long trend. It's a trend that goes back to the foundation of the Securities and Exchange Commission, when law and management expertise were seen as the necessary the requisite expertise in order to regulate financial markets. So why does this matter? Why does this little story or vignette matter? Because the way we have constituted regulators throughout this 20th century, in terms of the professions and the types of expertise that populate their bureaucracies and their organizations, limits the capacity of these regulators to act. If you compare the SEC with regulators in other highly technical domains, such as aviation, you'll see that the relationship between the regulator and the developments of technologies are quite different. Even though aviation regulators are all about rulemaking and standard making, they have a closer relationship with the developers of technologies, of aircrafts, than what the SEC has with the developers of market platforms. And this story matters quite a bit for the future of fintech, because at the end of the day, depending on the type of regulatory environment that you create, you can stifle or allow for forms of innovation that may or may not pose risks or issues in the future. And in particular, a lack of relevant expertise within the current regulatory environment can be a limit to the type of innovations that we see in the future. And an example is provided by, again, financial markets, and a book that became widely circulated and I'm very critical of, but is nonetheless a book that shows some of the consequences of the lack of understanding and expertise, which is Michael Lewis's, Flash Boys. It's all really a story of a lack of public confidence in the markets. When people say that financial markets are rigged, that's in part a reflection of a lack of expertise on how financial markets operate. And it's something that exists on the side of the public, but it's also something that is very much part of how regulators themselves have approached financial markets over the last 70 years with a legal rather than a technical perspective. And that's the story that I wanted to present, in a sense, the issue of incorporating expertise into regulatory organizations that better reflect these patterns of innovation. Thank you.